Welcome to Bashy's Corner, a program where we talk about important issues in an honest and respectful way with our guests. And today my guest is Dr. Jonas Christoffersen. He has a doctorate in law. He taught at the Copenhagen University, worked as a High Court judge, was a legal clerk at the Supreme Court, and in 2009 he was appointed as a director of the globally respected Danish Institute for Human Rights. All these achievements before he turned 40. Welcome to our program, Dr. Christoffersen.
Thank you so much.
Let me ask you first, are human rights in a better condition in Denmark today than it was a few years back?
I think when we take an overall picture of Denmark, we've seen areas where things have gone forward and areas where they have gone backwards. If we should point at two areas where things are better today, I would think children's rights have been on the increase. There's a better focus on children's rights today. Some minority rights are better. We got the right for homosexual couples to be married in church some years ago. Just last week, I think it was, Denmark said that if you want a transgender surgery, you do not have to be mentally diagnosed, have a mental diagnosis anymore. And Denmark is the first country in the world to do that. So some areas is going the right direction, and other areas is going the wrong direction.
So which areas are going in the wrong direction?
The area which I think we've seen the fastest decrease of human rights protection is the area of foreigners in Denmark. So asylum and foreigners in many different ways have been on the decrease.
Okay, when it comes to human rights, Denmark was criticized by UN through UPR process for not living up to its obligations. Do not politicians listen to you when you and the Human Rights Institute advise them?
They listen, but they do not always say what we advise them or do what we advise them to do. And I think that's fair. That's the way it should be. They have a political mandate. They have elected in by people. We're technocrats, which are a public institution. I'm a civil servant. So what I can do is I can advise them on what is my view and the Institute's view on human rights. And then it's up to them to make a political decision. But I would say that when we point out that there is a limit to human rights law, they definitely listen to it, and most of the time they would also basically back off from transgressing the border, but sometimes we disagree where the borderline is, and then they go their own way.
Mm-hmm. In the latest review in Geneva, the United Nations gave some concrete recommendations to Denmark. Can you tell our viewers about this?
Yes, it's a process. It's a complex process, but basically every 5 years, all members of the United Nations have to go before what we call the Human Rights Council. And there 47 states are members, and they can say to any country, we have a suggestion, something you should do, a recommendation, or they can ask questions about the human rights situation. And in Denmark, when Denmark's review was taking place earlier this year, we got a total of, let me just see if I can see, 199 recommendations.
That's a lot.
So ranging from children's rights to women's rights to national action plans, all kinds of different issues. And Denmark accepted about 120 of these recommendations. So we could go into all different...
120 of 199.
So there were 79 Denmark rejected for different reasons.
Okay, it sounds like a lot to me. Is it a lot, or what is the average? I mean, how does other countries like the Netherlands or Germany or Norway or other countries that we compare ourselves to?
Well, to me, it's not so interesting how other countries are viewed. For me, what is interesting is that we get recommendations, and then we have basically a process, a political dialogue in Denmark on what do we think we should do about this. Mm-hmm. So some of the recommendations that the government accepted, for example, on working more on hate crimes, we will then follow up with government and say, how would you do that? Okay. Then there are other areas who say, this we don't want to follow up on this one, and we will say, why not? Maybe it's a good recommendation. But sometimes Denmark gets recommendations that most people in Denmark say, but that's far-fetched, or it's based on a misunderstanding, so leave that aside. I think the key point is that instead of looking at the international human rights system as something telling us what to do, it's in this context, it's an opportunity for them to say, okay, there's an issue here. what do we do about it, and then make political decisions in Denmark on how to move on. And they can do other things in Germany and Sweden. I think we should focus on Denmark.
Okay, but up to Denmark's examination at the UN in Geneva, the Institute for Human Rights sent a so-called parallel report in which you gave recommendations on how Denmark can strengthen its efforts to combat, for instance, racial discriminations. Did Denmark accept these?
No, not many. In the field of ethnic discrimination, the key issue that was accepted by Denmark was the issue on hate crimes. Mm-hmm. That is a crime with a discriminatory purpose. So there we have a lot of work still to do, and we're keeping up that work irrespective of how the Geneva process ended.
Okay, so that's an ongoing process working, trying to influence the politicians.
I think that is key to human rights work, is that it is an ongoing process, and nobody who's a politician or a civil servant or an NGO person can expect that everybody will just do exactly what he or she thinks tomorrow. So people will have to keep fighting for their rights. We are fighting for other people's rights. I mean, many of the cases, what the Institute is doing is not promoting our own rights. My rights as a white 47-year-old male in Denmark, it's not my rights I'm fighting for in many cases. It's other people's rights. Mm-hmm. And that struggle will be ongoing. And sometimes it will take many years for things to change, and sometimes things are changed quite rapidly.
Okay.
But it is an ongoing process, and it's a democratic process, basically.
Okay. Last year in May, that would be May 2015, in an interview you said Denmark's efforts against racial discrimination are lagging behind and there is no desired effect. Can you elaborate on this?
Yes, I think the key problem about ethnic discrimination in Denmark is that we are blind to it. We don't see it, we don't understand it, and we don't recognize it. And one of the things that we did also last year, when that quote was when Denmark went before the Racial Discrimination Committee in Geneva. One of the areas that we focused on is what we call structural discrimination. Mm-hmm. Are there structures in the society that unintentionally, I would say in our case, keeps people of a different ethnic background than Danish in specific situations? And what we can see, for example, is that for many, many years, the ability of non-ethnic Danish children to learn what they should in public school is too low. I think it's about 40% of non-Western immigrant children that do not pass 9th grade, and it's 20% of ethnic Danes. So we have a structural problem in our basic education in getting non-white Danes to put their language through a basic education, which means that they can't get secondary education, they won't be as well in the job market. Okay. And what do we see? We see basically a country where social backgrounds is beginning to take on a color. And it's not as bad in Denmark as it is, for instance, in the United States. But I think when we look at the United States, we recognize immediately that black people are much less, in a much worse position in general than white people. We're getting to a situation in Denmark where that pattern is beginning to show. And I'm not saying that Denmark is a racist country, that we are discriminatory as such, but we're getting some structures in society that will be difficult to break, and that we need to understand. And as long as we don't understand it and see issues that way, we can't work with it.
Okay, so this is an important part of your job to address these issues, I think. The Institute is very respected and known in the world for its human rights work, but in Denmark it's not so much in the public eye. How is that?
I think that depends on how you measure it. If you look at the media attention that we have, the quotes in newspapers, on Facebook and all that, I think we are quite well respected and seen out there. Of course, we're not as seen as the Church Aid, Danish Church Aid. They have 15, 20 times more followers on Facebook than we have. But that's not our objective. We are not put on this planet to get members. We're not put on this planet to get public support from voters. We're put on this planet basically to monitor human rights in Denmark and tell politicians and others who have responsibility what could be what could be done, and to tell the NGO sector what are the human rights issues we see and help them out, and then they can do that work. So for us, we are not striving to be famous in Danish media, not at all.
Oh, okay.
Quite on the contrary, we try to stay out of media sometimes, because otherwise we couldn't be out there all the time.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the Institute? What does it do and when it was established?
Yes, the Institute was established in 1987. That was under the then conservative government. And what is interesting about 1987 is it was just before the break of the Berlin Wall. So at that time, movement in Europe began to focus on what can we do about human rights at home. And Danish politicians decided to establish a Center for Human Rights. And then we've been working for a number of years. And during those years, we have been given a new role. At the time, we were just a center of human rights that could do anything. Now we are recognized also by law and by Parliament as the National Human Rights Institution. So now there's an act established by Parliament saying we are the Danish National Human Rights Institution. We have a specific mandate, which is to protect and promote human rights in accordance with international standards. We're independent, and we're a public institution. And that is very important for us, because it shows that we are not an NGO. It means that I can't say anything that I want to say myself as a personal individual, or which I think my NGO members would like me to say. I have to play the role as National Human Rights Institution within that framework. Okay. And that's different from being an NGO.
Clearly. But Denmark is a democratic country. Is there a need for such an institute as the Human Rights Institute?
So far, luckily, the politicians have found it to be that way. So they have established us, they have re-established us, they have changed our act, improved our independence, and they are funding us. So they think that it's good to have a human rights institution. I think so too, and I think if you look at some of the results that have been achieved in Danish human rights protection, much of it is because we are here, because we have this independent human rights voice that can say to politicians and others what should be done and what could be done. Okay,
but a key word here in what you said is, for me, is independence, because your institute is financed by the Foreign Ministry. Does that mean they can tell you what to do and what to say and what not?
No, we're fully independent from the government and fully independent from Parliament, and we're not funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What we have is under the Finance Act, there's a line for us under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but there's also a line for the courts under the Ministry of Justice. And that doesn't mean that the courts are subject to the control of the Ministry of Justice. It just means it's a technical thing of where do you put the money.
Okay, that's an important.
It's very important, because it also means
technical detail.
Yeah, but it also means that it's not government that gives us our money. It's government and Parliament. It's the legislature, which means that if they want to change our funding, they have to change it by act and go back to Parliament and say, now we are decreasing the funding of the National Human Rights Institution. And then you have a public debate on it.
So any new government who disliked the institute couldn't just shut it down without a debate, or?
Exactly. That has to be done by law, and that of course cannot guarantee us that we will never be changed.
Of course.
Just as you can't guarantee that courts will not be changed. That's more difficult because they're in the Constitution, we are not. But that's the name of the game, because otherwise we would be lifted out of the political system, and we can't have that when you are a public institution. Okay. So if you wanted to take us out of that political system, you wouldn't have a public institution, then you would have something else, which is an NGO, when we're not an NGO. And you can have other very good NGOs, but it's just not what we are.
Okay. You often emphasize that the institute should be defined by its credibility. What exactly do you mean by that?
I mean that when you read what we write or hear what we say, you should be able to trust that we do the best to our ability to live up to our role, which is different from the roles of others. So I hope that when NGOs and politicians and civil servants and people in the newspaper, when they hear me say something, they trust that is in accordance with human rights law. If I say this is a violation of human rights, it's to the best of my ability and my assessment. So if I say this is not a violation, that's also the case.
Okay, and now we're talking international standards.
We're talking international standards or the standards under the Constitution.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have, I have meetings with NGOs who say, why don't you push this agenda more? Or why do you take on that position? And I'm saying, that's because of human rights law. That's my best assessment. And they say, but that's not ethical. I say, that may be so, but that's law. Mm-hmm. And I would say to the NGO, but when I go back to Parliament and talk to politicians who may think differently, I should be able to say the same. So independence for me means that we make our own opinion. We listen to politicians, we listen to public debate, we listen to NGOs, we read international sources, and we make our independent, objective assessment of what we think is human rights in Denmark and how that could be promoted. And people should know what they get when they talk to us, and they get something else than when they talk to politicians or NGOs, and that's what they get from us.
Okay. In these years, it's becoming more common that politicians, and especially from Danish People's Party, but not only from that party, we ask Denmark, or talk about Denmark needs to leave these human rights conventions. Can that be done practically?
On a technical, practical level, yes. For instance, the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the most important human rights convention, there's a provision saying any state can step back in 6 months. So the foreign minister could write a note to the General Secretary of the Council of Europe saying we're withdrawing from the European Convention. And 6 months later, we would be out. Okay. And you could do that in all these conventions, basically sign up. You went into them, you can get out of them again. Mm-hmm. Where it would be more difficult would be the European Union. There we also have human rights obligations as part of a membership of the European Union. But in principle, we could also withdraw from the Union. So in principle, yes, we could just get out. In real life, it's very, very difficult for a state to get out of international cooperation in the field of human rights. So in practical life, it can't really happen. And I don't think that it will happen. And I think what the politicians are doing is they are sending a signal to the general public that they don't like that human rights issue. And if they could change human rights, they would, but they can't. So they say, let's withdraw from the conventions. And then they take a free point home and sending a signal. And most of them know that it won't have any effect.
Could you foresee the consequences of leaving the conventions if Denmark were to do that?
Well, you could, in principle, you could have 2 scenarios. Let's say that Denmark withdrew from all the obligations. Then you could have the scenario, which is the good scenario, that wouldn't change anything, because basically the politicians would more or less do the same. You know, sometimes they would tighten a little bit on immigration law, but mostly they would do the same. Mm-hmm. The other scenario is that they would strip off of all our human rights. Everybody's no freedom of expression, no freedom of movement, no fair trial, no right to education, no right to health, no housing, nothing. They would take all our rights away. So that would never happen. So I think we should, when we talk about, I think the reason why I put it this way is that I think it's important for us to reflect on what human rights in reality give us. And in reality, I think in Denmark, they do not give us very much, because most of the values in human rights have already been in Denmark. I mean, we had a strong human rights.
They're implemented in Danish law. Or?
It's implemented and it's changed, but it didn't come to Denmark through human rights. We had human rights before we got human rights conventions. Mm-hmm. So we had the right to education in Denmark. I think the anniversary was last year. We had the right to compulsory education for 200 years. 200 years. We had the right to vote for women for 100 years last year. That's way before the conventions. We abolished slavery before we had human rights conventions. So a lot of the things that are human rights conventions today, we already had before. So I don't think we will ever go back to a situation where nobody has any human rights. But I think some of the areas where we really need human rights protection today, and where the politicians are very critical, that's where we would see a decline in protection. And the only area is foreigners' human rights. That's the area where politicians, the only area where they're talking about getting out of human rights obligations. That's in respect of foreigners.
That is the big issue these years. And you often criticize Danish alien laws and even call some of these laws harmful. But are they really so bad?
I think when you get into that discussion, I think we can do it in two ways. We can either say Danish immigration policy and foreign policy issues are all racist and have been so for 25 years. Some NGOs would argue that. Or you could say there's nothing really wrong with it. That's Danish People's Party and people who sympathize with their view on the other side. Mm-hmm. I think the reality is somewhere in between. Mm-hmm. And then you basically need to go down into every single issue and say, okay, that issue. But I'll give you an example. Last year we had this, I can show you a picture here, which you may remember. This is from our annual report last year. Mm-hmm. This is refugees and migrants going through the Danish border and walking on the highway.
Quite famous picture from...
Yeah, and in many ways it framed human rights in Denmark in 2015. Mm-hmm. Later the politicians say, but we need to be able to contain this if it happened again. So we want to be able to deprive these people of their liberty, put them somewhere so we can control their identity if that happened again. Then we looked at that from a human rights perspective. That's perfectly fine. What is not fine is that there's a time limit of how long can you do that. Maybe you can do that for a week or two, but not longer.
Okay.
But the government didn't put any time limit into the act. So we criticized that and said, but how long do you want to keep them there?
Yeah.
And the ministry basically said, yes, the Danish Institute is right. There's a time limit, and we will observe that in practice. But in the law, which is now passed and is in the law book, there's no time limit. So it would be perfectly legal for the government to detain somebody of his or her liberty for 3 months.
Indefinitely.
4 months, 5 months, 6 months.
Yeah.
They could do that without violating the law. Then they would violate human rights, and we would never do that. And then you can argue, how bad is that? So the civil servants say, don't worry, everybody, we will make sure everything is fine. Then it's not bad, then it's okay. If they make a mistake, if somebody is forgotten in the system, somebody sits there for a very long time, we have a problem. So you need to go through this issue one by one. But I think the totality of all these tightenings we've seen in this area is that we have a decrease in protection and respect of foreigners' human rights in Denmark.
Okay. Another issue presently is Denmark is trying to make some laws to ban foreign speakers to come and give lectures because politicians call it undemocratic and hateful expressions. We are, of course, talking about Muslim preachers coming here. What is your position on this? Is it not against the idea of freedom of expression to ban this?
Yes, it is. And I think it's a very good example of the dilemma that politicians face and that society faces. Because on the one hand, you can say you have the right to freedom of religion and their freedom of expression and their right to move around and preach as they see fit all over the world. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, some of the interviews or TV programs that gave rise to this showed that they would preach a violation of women's rights. So what is more important? Freedom of expression and religion or women's rights? I think in this case, I would say women's rights are more important than the freedom of expression. But how do you then delimit this? How do you protect women from this? Because how can they protect themselves if they live in these environments where this is ongoing? This is the norms around them, and they are then, these norms are supported, the suppressed women are supported by some of these imams. Mm-hmm. And then you would say that the Danish tradition is let them say what they want to say. We can deal with that as society. But the politicians have said, but we think we should limit their rights, their freedom rights, in order to protect these women, for example, or in order to protect these damaging environment that would radicalize young boys in Denmark. So that's the trade-off. And our role in this as a public institution is to say when that balance is being changed, so we put a little bit less weight on freedom rights, when do we then violate human rights? And what we have said so far is that the problem is that it's very difficult to delimit who is undermining democracy, who is going too far in their expression. What do you do, for example, if an imam says something in a private location? What if he says it in public? It's different issues. So a lot of difficult legal issues. So basically it said that we only target the intervention against people who have seriously done something which could be considered wrong. And I think it's a tricky one, but I think it just basically shows that there's a dilemma that we need to address.
Okay. You travel a lot and you meet foreign leaders and human rights activists from all over the world. Is the outside world critical of Danish policies?
I think that in the beginning of this year, and since then, a lot of people have raised a lot of questions about the so-called jewelry rule, that we would say that we would take jewelry off of migrants that came to Denmark so they could pay for their own stay while their asylum application was processed. I think also there's a tendency to, in some places, to look with some skepticism against Danish immigration politics. But I think it's much different now, since the right wing is on the move in all of Europe. So people who associate themselves with that movement think Denmark more as a leading figure than that's something that you should look down on. So I think that the picture is quite different depending on who you ask.
Yeah.
But I still think if you go out and ask in the world, is Denmark basically a positive country? Do you have respect for Danish values and so on? I think more people will say yes than no. But I think our reputation is different today than it was 10-15 years ago.
Okay. Someone once said that human rights must be made a fact, not just an idealistic dream. Do you agree with that?
I think it should be both.
Okay.
If we use the example before between the difference between an NGO and a national human rights institution, I think the NGO should be idealistic. It should push its own agenda, its own ideas to the fullest of its capacity, and just argue its own cause as much as possible, and be idealistic. I think a national human rights institution has to be pragmatic. We have to understand that we live in a democracy, that we have all the taxpayers in Denmark are funded us. So we can't just pick up one idea. So we have to live in a different and work in a different context and within our democratic system, and be more pragmatic. But I think we will still basically share the same vision, namely more human rights for everybody. But I think that the speed at which we can move and the ways we can maneuver are quite different.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that Dr. Jonas Christoffersen has given you, the viewers, some food for thought. As long as Denmark has dedicated people like him, there are still hope for the protection of human rights. Thank you for sharing your views with us. Thanks for coming here. Thank you for watching. See you next time.